So just to get started, I was hoping that what you could do is just provide a quick introduction of obviously who you are and a little bit about your journey to where you are today.
Yeah, and thanks again, Elsa, for the opportunity to meet with you and the rest of the group. So my journey started about 20 years ago in the medical device industry, and it started with a role as a reviewer of cardiovascular devices at the Food and Drug Administration. I was fascinated at the time with medical technology, as I still am today. And I thought this was a great opportunity to enter the industry and work with some really smart people. And I got an opportunity to evaluate a range of technologies and ended up staying there for 12 years. I transitioned in the middle of business school to a role at Danaher, which is a medical device company with a business and dental, which I had reviewed at the FDA. And I took on a role eventually as a vice president of regulatory and quality at Danaher. Was there for about 3.5 years. And since then, I've split my time consulting, helping companies navigate the FDA, because that's where I developed my domain expertise. And I'm a venture partner in Wavemaker 360 Health, where we invest in medical devices, digital health solutions, and diagnostic devices. And I lead the MedTech practice, the traditional medical device practice. Along that journey, I was fortunate enough to found a nonprofit called MedTech Color that we could talk a bit about later on.
Great. Yeah, thank you very much. I think one of the interesting bits of your background as well is that you started with physics and material engineering and ended up in sort of the regulatory and then business and venture space. So it would be interesting just to hear that transition about how you went from a more of a technical kind of a starting point to where you are today.
Yeah, so there were two key points in my journey that I think eventually got me to a more role in business. One, when I was looking at graduate programs in materials engineering, I was hopeful that there was some synergy or some work I could do that would apply to the medical device industry. My graduate advisor at the time said, Kwame, there's this material called nitinol, and it's going to be big in the medical device business. So if you're interested in nitinol and learning about that, then do it. So I did. He was right. Nitinol is used in many, many medical technologies. The second big event, after having worked at the FDA for 11 years, was to decide to go back to school. I went to University of Virginia for engineering, and in my mind, the best way to transition to the for-profit world was to get an MBA. And I had also come to terms with the most likely role I was going to get was in regulatory because of my background. For a long time, I wanted to explore roles in general management, but it was too much swimming upstream, and there was immense opportunity that eventually led me to running my own business and working in the investment space. So those are the two things that happened.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. So why did you said, because of your background, the regulatory, place is where you thought you'd end up. Can you talk a little more about that?
Yeah, so 99% of the people who leave the FDA, they either retire fully or they take a role as in regulatory affairs.
Okay.
I could probably count on one hand out of the dozens of people who I know who left the FDA that they did anything other than regulatory. It's because people value, if you even spent 2 years at the FDA, people value that and they immediately think you should be in the regulatory group.
Yeah. Okay. All right. That makes sense. And so you've worked both internally, as you mentioned, at companies like Danaher, and then more, obviously at FDA, as you mentioned, and then also as a consultant. So how have those experiences, in different kinds of organizations shaped your perspective on the industry?
Thank you. So I think about a few things that I've learned along the way. One, the industry is predominantly comprised of small companies like the cohort that's here. It is actually a very, very, very shockingly small percentage of medical device companies that have more than 10 employees.
Mm.
And there really is no mid-size when it comes to MedTech. You're either small or you're big, or you're growing to get acquired into a big company.
Mm-hmm.
Very few mid-sized companies. So that was one revelation. The other is that it truly is a team ecosystem play in the early days. And the sooner for early stage companies that you have a team that's comprised of regulatory, quality, clinical, reimbursement, a biostatistician, as soon as you have those team members in place, either full-time or consultants, the sooner you're going to optimize for success.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing I think that I grew to appreciate is the entry and permanence of non-traditional players in medtech. And what do I mean by that? Google was knocking on FDA's door 10 years ago, believe it or not. Apple, the same thing. These are not new. Now they're not new, but 10 years ago, they were first putting their pinky toe in this regulated space. Now they're fully in it. The most recent example is Bakul Patel. It was just announced he left the FDA like last week, and now he's head of regulatory for Google.
Yeah.
So he went from the FDA to Google, and that's another signal that these companies are here to stay in this regulated space.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Yeah, and with your, you mentioned the diversity of staff members as well, and building the team. When you're looking at smaller companies as as like an investor side of it, looking at who they have in-house, how do you balance? First of all, maybe you can comment on what you're looking for, and then secondly, how do you balance the thinking around having sort of too many people when you're still too early? You don't want to hire 10 people when you're still at, just concept development really early. And how do you think about that from your investment point of view?
When we meet companies, it is not uncommon for them to be a company of 2 people and they're raising the capital to go to 10. So we're clear-eyed that we are meeting companies and often investing with angel investors that they are in their nascent stage. What's important for us is they have a clear view of the team they need to bring on board, and maybe even have a short list of names of experts that they either want to bring on as consultants when they raise that $3 million or full-time. And typically, the classic team is some scientific lead and some business lead.
Yeah.
And that's the nucleus. And from there, you can bring on all the other expertise. Generally, you can attract all the other expertise that you need to be a venture backable company.
Mm-hmm. Is there one one hire or one individual, one expertise that you really expect to see at a startup that you don't even look at them unless they've considered X, Y, and Z, or is every company different and that's okay?
So it's really hard to back a company that doesn't have, at a minimum, an advisor or a co-founder who eventually knows how to get to the first $1 million in sales and has some demonstrated ability to do that. And generally speaking, for regulated traditional medical devices, and there are increasingly becoming exceptions, IP that makes it valuable, and a scientist or scientific founder or co-founder who has intimate familiarity with the novelty and the uniqueness from a scientific or technical perspective of that solution. To me, those are kind of table stakes. That is a minimum core group that you need to have in place.
Yeah.
From there, you can convince others to come on board.
Mm-hmm. So then, the next question might be, how do I get that experience if I don't have that experience, right? So I guess you kind of hire in, so to speak, someone that has experience raising that money, or it's sort of that I can't get the
Yeah.
experience because no one will give me a chance, but no one will give me a chance because I don't have the experience.
Yeah. So I would say, first of all, it's not easy.
Yeah, it's not
And
easy.
I think anyone telling you to bring on or identify a co-founder to complement you, if they say it's easy, they're naive or lying to you.
Yeah.
And it is through a series of relationships that you build through talking to people and, quite candidly, asking them to put their pinky toe in as an advisor, for example. Maybe say, can you be a business advisor for me?
Yeah.
And ask them a very specific question just to nurture the relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And you can do that ideally with 4 or 5 people and identify a person that you would want to invite in to either be an advisor or a co-founder
Mm-hmm.
to round out your team.
Yeah. Okay. That's helpful. Thank you. Let's shift and talk a little bit about the regulatory side. Especially the companies that are here, that are represented today. That's obviously a pathway that people have to go down, and I think there's given the companies that we have here, we actually have a very wide range. We have devices that need very little clinical data and can 510K, and ones that are going to need pediatric PMAs, so like everything in between. Where in the development process, I've seen in my career where folks have had, they kind of bring regulatory in too late, or they haven't thought about it, kind of throughout the process. But I'm curious, in your experience, like when should you have a regulatory discussion, or when should you work that into your development timeline so that you know where you're going?
So I think an ideal time is around this point. When you're beyond concept phase, you've probably raised a pre-seed round. Some people call it friends and family round, built a prototype, have done some customer discovery, and have a draft indications for use, can describe the technology in concert with an engineer, someone technically minded, and have a clear idea of the short list of claims that are going to differentiate you in the market.
Mm-hmm.
And normally, your competitors. That's a fourth element.
Mm-hmm.
Once you know those things, a regulatory expert can clearly lay out a strategy to get your product through any regulatory body.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the time. And it typically is when you're raising your seed round, you identify in your budget regulatory expertise. Or if you're NIH funded or NSF funded, there's a bucket of money called TABA funding, which you can use for service providers.
Yeah.
So those are probably times. And I can talk about the reasons why you want to get a regulatory strategy early. I wrote some blog posts about it.
Yeah.
But that's about the time.
Yeah. Give us a couple snippets about why that's the right timing.
Well, if you are looking to take on outside investors, specifically angels or institutional investors, VCs, it's table stakes. They're going to just want to know that you've thought through the regulatory path. And the crisper and more concrete, the better. 2, it signals a level of credibility that you're a serious venture grade company. And quite candidly, some of you may be building non-venture grade companies, lifestyle companies, or cash flow businesses. It can only enhance the quality of your product if you have an expert that you offshore, because it is extremely difficult and not a good use of a CEO's time to try and become a regulatory expert.
Right.
Those are a couple of reasons why.
Yeah. Yeah. Good. So it's interesting to me that that point that you said is a good time to bring regulatory in, because I maybe this is an incorrect assumption. So interested in your point of view is that when you're putting your prototype together or thinking about those indications in their first use, that it would be good to know what that regulatory pathway might be, because might you design it differently if you can take a 510K approach versus something that might need more clinical data, or does that extra iteration happen after you start the regulatory process?
So to your point, I have been asked to participate in workshops when companies are refining the first product that they want to send to market.
Mm-hmm.
And that could potentially happen pre-prototype. And it's fine to bring a regulatory person in. So there is no downside. You would get a series of options from a regulatory expert that says if you want to build product A with these claims, the path to market, for example, is de novo.
Yeah.
And I was just talking to a potential client. If you want to build product P, the path to market is a 510K.
Mm-hmm.
So that may be useful in the early days, but regulatory ideally should be a factor in the business decisions. But sometimes it's a driving factor that
Mm-hmm.
leads the company to launch one product before another.
Oh, okay. Yeah, because I also, the costs associated with doing the clinical work and, developing the product of the scale enough that you can, do all of that before it's on the market. I see how that kind of plays into it as well. So if you could create sort of two different versions of the product where you could get one out earlier and then maybe launch another version that takes that additional work down the road as an option, is what it sounds like. Yeah. Yeah, great. And we've also heard that getting some early conversations with FDA is useful. Can you talk a little bit about that? When is a good time to talk to FDA? Like how mature should you be, and what kind of information do you need to have ready for those first couple of conversations?
I would say for most of the companies, probably all the companies in your cohort,
Mm-hmm.
you're building bleeding edge, innovative technologies such that you may have a couple key questions where you can't find a lot of valid predicates to answer those questions. I know Silcath is in the audience.
Yeah.
Even Silcath may not find appropriate predicates for their product.
Yep.
Or they want to be crystal clear on the clinical study needed to support their application. That's the number one most common question.
Mm-hmm.
The second most common question is, I'm not 100% sure how the product is regulated. Is it regulated as a drug if it's a combination product?
Mm-hmm.
Is it regulated as a 510K or de novo? And there's another application type called 513G. And when you have those questions clear in your mind, either before the regulatory strategy or after you have a regulatory strategy written up, it's a great time to meet with the FDA. The last thing I'll say, IIsa, before we move to the next question is, ideally, and I'm going to say something like duh, Kwame, of course, but ideally, you want to be well capitalized so that you have enough money to execute on the feedback you get from the FDA so that you can turn around and meet the FDA with the data that they asked for or whatever was unclarified, clarified, ideally within 6 months.
Mm-hmm.
If the reason why I say that is if you get feedback from FDA on day 0 about a clinical trial design, and you go back to the FDA with that clinical study 2 years later, their thinking may have changed, potentially.
Interesting.
So it's better to have a lot of money and momentum so that you can clip through this quickly.
Yeah.
There's no beauty in having 10 conversations with the FDA. You want to have as many as you need to get through it efficiently.
Yeah, that's helpful. It is logical, but not necessarily something that you might have thought of, right? That you need the money to be able to do what FDA asks you to do. Yeah.
That's right. That's right.
We wanted to talk a little about the VC community and what's going on with that space right now with Wavemaker 360 Health. Maybe tell us a little bit about what you guys do and what you're seeing in the med device space right now.
Yeah, Wavemaker 360 Health is a healthcare-only seed stage venture capital fund. And we invest in companies that are raising somewhere between $1 to $5 million and what's typically described as a seed round. There generally is at least one full-time employee. And the way we differentiate is we have over 300 investors called LPs. And most of these investors are healthcare executives that want to give back. So they help us source great companies, diligence them, and support them when they need our help. Let me be very specific. We invested in a company called Epitel. Epitel is a non-invasive diagnostic to detect seizures based out of Utah. And they emailed us this morning saying that we just hired our VP of sales and we wanted to see if there are any introductions you can make to customers that we want to sell into.
Mm-hmm.
We have a very specific program we call lifeguarding, where the partners meet with the company, and based on their needs, we connect them with our LPs who can make those introductions.
Great.
So that's our fund, and that's how we differentiate.
Yeah. And so, what have you seen in this space? Just from a dynamics perspective, with COVID, either things were significantly better or significantly worse, depending on what part of the medical world you were in. Just curious, to hear a little bit about the kind of the funding trends, or if the money is available now, or are people a little shy and kind of holding back?
Yeah, so the money is still available because capital poured into digital health. One, they also poured into venture capital funds,
Mm-hmm.
and we have to deploy that capital in a certain number of years. What is changing is price. When I say price, venture capitals are gaining leverage in determining a lower price. And let me just be specific. Typically when companies are raising a seed round of $1 to $5 million, their pre-money valuations are in the teens, somewhere between 10 to $17 million.
Mm-hmm.
We met companies who would say, we regularly, in the height of the pandemic, because these companies had negotiating power, say, oh, I have a term sheet with a pre-money of 20 million and I'm raising 5 million. And those are high prices for us. So that's another mega trend. And in 2023, I think pricing will come down. VCs will still have to invest money, but they'll be more selective. Some of the C and B minus, well, actually, some of the C-level companies may not be able to raise their next round.
Mm-hmm.
So the mega trend also we're seeing is companies are raising bigger rounds now to tide them over through 2023.
Mm-hmm.
The last thing I'll talk about in terms of clinical trends is technologies that can help nurses, the nurse staffing issue, digitally enabled technologies,
Mm-hmm.
and quite candidly, any solution that leverages and monetizes data.
Mm-hmm.
We're seeing more and more of those opportunities. And let me even be more specific. When I started 20 years ago, you could build a wildly successful business making a widget that was a dumb device, didn't talk to the cloud, or didn't even handle data at all. Now we're seeing companies that are putting sensors in knee implants,
Mm-hmm.
sensors in hip implants, shoulder. Everybody wants to capture data and monetize it. So I think there's always going to be a place for hardware in our industry, but increasingly solutions try and capture and monetize data. And I would be thinking about that in my solution, if at all possible.
And are with Wavemaker and other venture firms, do they target those certain kinds of companies, then they don't look at anyone else? Or think people are open to hearing about other things at this time?
We're open to hearing all types of solutions. It's just, if all things are equal, if company B can monetize and generate recurring revenue off of data, they're going to get our money before the dumb device does.
Okay, yeah. And dumb in the nicest way, of course.
in the nicest way possible.
We have two of our attendees here that are interested in strategic relationships rather than, I suppose they take venture money, but maybe down the line, strategic relationships. Could you maybe just kind of comment on your thinking about maybe the pros and cons of one over the other?
When engaging strategics, generally speaking, they want line of sight to revenue, or they see the possibility of your technology being a strategic fit, obviously, or a tuck-in or complementary. So they'll put a little capital to work in your business just for the right to get information on a regular basis. The things to look out for is exclusivity in markets that are important to you. Some companies don't want any exclusivity. And what I mean by that, just to be simple in my terms, big company X says, we will invest $1 million in your product if you give us the exclusive right to sell your product in India or China, and you may or may not like that deal. I met with a company who was in talks with a large strategic that wanted global exclusivity. So that was a non-start. Those are and the other watch out for partnering with a particular strategic early on is it may signal to other potential acquirers that you're going to get bought by that strategic X. So just be mindful of the optics of that. Some companies like J&J are so known to invest in a range of companies that I don't think you run the danger of saying, well, J&J invested in us, so a competitor X is going to never deal with you. Everybody knows J&J invests widely, but some know that other companies are very, very focused and they're just doing a build to buy type of operation.
Yeah, that's helpful. Great, thank you. One of the things that we've been working on the past 2 days is kind of crafting an elevator pitch or like a little story to be able to describe a company or technology. Just kind of curious to your point of view, like when those are useful. Like, do you want to hear like maybe to change the question, like what do you prefer, having like that clean elevator pitch that you hear from someone that sounds like they've put a lot of thought into it, versus more of a casual discussion to kind of hear their point of view on an unmet need, and like how do you think about that initial, you meet someone at a networking event and like what do you like to hear from them in that first few minutes about their technology?
I would say, to be very candid, and this is just a function of experience, I calibrate for if I meet someone who's raising a pre-seed round or a seed round or an A round. And by the time you're raising your A, you should have a very crisp, tight elevator pitch.
Yep.
When you're just starting out, just meeting with VCs in a pre-seed stage, it can be a little rough. The one thing that by the seed stage, I expect it to be fairly crisp and to not bury the lead. And here are some leads that excite me.
Yeah.
So here's some things that you don't really even need to put in an elevator pitch. It's IP protected. That's almost like table stakes unless you're building a software product. But if you have your first 5 customers lined up and you're going to launch in the next 3 months, that's a nice lead or something you may want to put in that elevator pitch. Because quite candidly, and I know some of the people maybe have a clinical or science background, your elevator pitch should be, generally speaking, focused on how you're going to get to your first million and what enabling milestones are going to get you there. Because VCs generally won't even come in before revenue. They may come in before 510K or at 510K. So your story has to be, I'm building momentum to get my 510K, so I'm just telling you early, or I got my 510K and I'm ready to take your institutional dollars.
Yeah. And
really, there are only a couple key milestones that VCs care about. How do you get to your first million? Do you have your regulatory approval? Are you reimbursed? It's only a few things like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
that really get the ball.
So the words that they're using should lead to that understanding that this is with this product that has these benefits and this kind of outcome. That's where the money's going to come from. And
right.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, great. We've been talking a little bit about focus for a startup as well. We're doing a case study through the course where we're looking at an arthroscopic device, from the Hydrocision device back when it was started in the late 90s. And so we're kind of using that as a case study. One of the things they talk about in there is deciding about focusing on the orthopedic application versus all the other applications that they have. And we were fortunate enough through Rana Taylor, who was one of our other speakers. We had the current CEO of Hydrocision actually came by and talked to us earlier, Alain Transmontagna, and we asked him this question. So I'm curious your point of view as well around how much focus should a startup company have on one technology or one indication or one application versus or maybe while also, depending on your point of view, while also showing the future platform capabilities or growth into other areas And maybe thinking, maybe you could put two hats on and answer it from a regulatory perspective and answer it from an investor perspective.
The more valuable company in general is a platform with multiple products on a roadmap. And that story can be told on one slide in a pitch deck. The majority of the time and energy in the conversation for a CEO should be demonstrating that he or she is focused on the milestones to get that first product to market. And that's where the focus comes in. You know the indication, you know the population, you know the clinical setting, you know how you're going to get reimbursed, you know the clinical study you need to do. The more definitiveness you can have on those key milestones to get that product out the door, that's where you should spend 80% of your time conversing and telling that story. The platform play is obvious, but everyone in this business knows you can't get to the platform until you successfully launch that first product.
Mm-hmm.
And that has to be where you have laser-like focus, period. So I know it seems like kind of a mixed message, but I would just say, and this is well understood in the industry, most medical device companies live or die on that one product that they're building and launching
Mm-hmm.
to be able to get to the other products in the platform.
Yeah. So that focus is important, but then ensuring that you have some next steps down the road. Would your regulatory approach differ much with that platform approach? I don't know. As I ask the question, I'm like, I don't know. But
yeah, I would say I'm working with a company who wants to launch in the US and then quickly launch in the EU because their marketing lead is based in London. And they have the ability to focus on that market. But when they communicate to their investors, they say market number one is the US, market number two is Europe.
Yeah.
There's no ambiguity there. And this is why all the work we did for the US is going to be able to be reused for the EU.
Yeah.
So that's the level of focus and clarity any CEO should have. So no, there's this expression, a confused mind says no. It's not my expression, but I love it.
Yeah.
And the number one job for a CEO is to tell a clear and concise story that doesn't confuse.
Yeah. Yeah. That's interesting. Well, I think that's a great quote to end on. Well, I think on behalf of all the attendees and the team for the Catalyst program, thank you very much for your time today. Really great to speak with you and to hear your perspective on the industry as always. So thank you very much, and we will be in touch.
Oh, thank you, Elsa. And thanks you to everyone at Harvard. Bye.
Take care.